So we are Group 1, and we will be presenting on the gig economy and COVID-19's effect on the gig economy. So as you can see here on the left side of the slide, the gig economy revolves around the ability to choose your own hours, to choose your own work, to be your own boss, and to control your own income. Essentially, the gig economy revolves around freedom. Now, the gig economy, which is also known as the sharing economy, is universally difficult to define because it is so vast. Basically, though, the gig economy is a catch-all term for freelance work and for peer-to-peer firms that connect people for the purposes of distributing, reusing, and sharing goods and services. Recently, the gig economy has been heavily associated with technological peer-to-peer firms, and this wave started in 1995 with the invention of Craigslist and eBay. Then in 2003, Couchsurfing.com was created, which led way in 2008 to the invention of arguably the most successful gig economy company, known as Airbnb. And then, to round out the timeline, a couple more notable technological gig economy companies include the invention of Uber in 2009, Instacart in 2012, and DoorDash in 2013. Now moving on to the state of the gig economy pre-COVID, it was in one word, booming. We can see here that in the 5 years following the invention of DoorDash, between the years of 2014 and 2018, that the number of workers in the gig economy increased 8.1%. In that same time period, the United States workforce only increased 2.6%. This means that in the 5 year period of time, the number of people employed in the gig economy grew over 3 times as fast as the traditional workforce. Now, economists Shamika Ravi and Niyam Yuragi of the Brookings Institute attribute this rapid growth primarily to Uber and Airbnb. More specifically, they attribute the growth to the fact that driving services such as Uber and Lyft have less requirements than those of taxis, and that Airbnb rates are between 30 and 60% cheaper than hotel rates around the world. Now flash forward to the most recent COVID-free year in 2019. The gig economy set all-time highs for number of employees in the US and in United States revenue. And this $1.3 trillion revenue is almost as much as the entire GDP of Spain. So another staggering statistic is that 40% of gig economy employees use their gig as their primary source of income. So pre-COVID, the gig economy was at such an all-time high that many people were living solely on their gig revenue.
So as you can imagine, the gig economy is pretty difficult to count because of its transient characteristics. But governing bodies have broken temporary workers down into two types: contingent workers, who have no contract for long-term employment, and alternative employees, who act as independent contractors, freelancers, on-call employees, and workers provided by temporary help agencies. However, although this framework is helpful, there are a few issues. Temporary workers are double counted as being under one of these types, and part-time workers, self-employed workers, and those that hold multiple jobs. Now, the two main bodies that count the gig economy are the Bureau of Labor Statistics, also known as BLS, and the U.S. Census Bureau. The U.S. Census disregards the classification of temporary workers, but instead counts the number of non-employers, which consist of businesses that don't have any paid employees on contract, but are subject to federal income tax. Now, the BLS is the definitive authority and has the largest survey of the workforce. They report the number of gig workers through 3 separate publications: the Contingent Workers Survey, the Spotlights on Alternative Employment, and the Current Employment Statistics Survey. Now on the next slide, we'll see a chart that I have created from the Bureau of Labor Statistics data from their employment, hours, and earnings from the Current Employment Statistics Survey, which surveys approximately 145,000 businesses and government agencies. However, this survey only counts workers whose gig job is their main source of income. Therefore, they don't include workers that have a full-time job in addition to their gig job. Now, the data reflected in this chart is the month-over-month seasonally adjusted number of workers who consider themselves temporary help within the professional and business services. Here we see a steady increase since 2010 for all years except 2020. There was a 30% decrease in the number of temporary workers from March 2020 to April 2020 when COVID hit. And the data shows that the gig economy has recovered up to September 2018 levels, and experts predict that the number of these temporary workers will continue to increase up to normal levels. Now on the next slide, we ask ourselves, why has there been a steady increase of the gig economy? Well, more and more workers are preferring to have more freedom and flexibility in their working hours rather than the typical Monday through Friday, 8 to 5 p.m. In addition, the gig economy provides an outlet for otherwise unskilled workers to deliver food, drive people around, and walk other people's dogs. And we see an increase in the gig economy because there have been more and more online platforms like Uber, TaskRabbit, and Upwork that match tasks to temporary workers. And lastly, we see a trend where more and more firms are hiring non-employee workers, meaning that those workers are not on a long-term contract. And this gives the firm more flexibility. And these workers are cheaper. They don't require typical hiring, firing, and retaining costs. And firms don't have to offer benefits like health insurance, and they can match people with specific skills to specific projects.
Here we have created a graph summarizing the information we have found specifically as it relates to COVID in the short run. First, we have shown labor supply in blue and labor demand in red. To signify the market before the pandemic, and for a timestamp, let's call that maybe January or February of this year, we have drawn an ordinary supply and demand curve with no subscript. At the beginning of quarantine and the impact of the virus, we saw a drastic increase in the demand for some gig economy roles, such as DoorDash, Instacart, and Postmates, and a decrease for others, such as Uber and Lyft. Overall, however, most research has pointed to a net increase in demand for gig economy roles depicted in the shift to demand one. On the supply side, we saw an initial decrease, with many workers under statewide stay-home orders depicted in the shift to supply one. Overall, this led to a very short but lucrative period with rising wages for those who were still employed by the gig economy or for those who were able to join. After the initial shutdown, things began to open back up, meaning slight although hesitant use of Uber and Lyft began to re-enter the scene, along with a slight decrease in food and grocery delivery due to people feeling more confident to re-enter their retailers and restaurants. This is where the graphical depiction becomes slightly uncertain. On the graph, we have depicted a decrease in demand from the initial spike, but the magnitude of this shift is completely unknown. In other words, demand 2 could be anywhere from where it is drawn currently to where demand 1 was at the height of lockdown. On the supply side, we saw a drastic increase from those who were former Uber drivers now using their cars for Postmates, and those who were former 8 to 5 workers who were either furloughed or laid off and now treating the gig economy as their main source of income. A supply shift that overpowered the shift in demand is what we saw, and that prompted the move from supply 1 to supply 2. Since the situation is constantly changing and the gig economy is so nuanced that it's very difficult to depict shifts of any kind, all we can say conclusively for the short run is that employment has increased in the gig economy since it has grown, while the effect on wages, even in the short run, has been anywhere from drastic increases early on to cuts now, making the movement along the wage axis much more complex than our graph can explain. Overall, however, as the effects of the pandemic have begun to settle, we have seen a continuing decrease in wages for gig economy roles, making our graphic representation a step in the process to the long run.
Now I'm going to talk about COVID's impact on the gig economy specifically. As Isaiah was talking about, there are very different markets within the gig economy, such as Airbnb, Uber, and Instacart, and a lot of these have had different, and COVID has had different impacts on these different sectors. There has been some expanding markets, such as e-commerce and grocery delivery, food delivery, and Amazon delivery. For example, Upwork, an e-commerce site, has experienced a 50% increase in freelancers as a result of the pandemic or correlated along with the pandemic. And Instacart hired 300,000 more people in just 1 month in May. But then there's also been shrinking markets along with COVID, things that are more dangerous for health, such as transportation or ride sharing. You can see on the graph to the right how ride sharing services have decreased revenue by almost 75%, whereas Uber Eats and grocery or food delivery services have increased their revenue. We've also seen decreases in revenue for the entertainment business, such as musicians or other forms of entertainment. Now we're going to move towards more specific impacts. As Liz was talking about, there were obvious shifts in labor supply and labor demand. While we don't know exactly where those end up, we did see a large influx in workers. By like mid-May, there were 36 million new jobless people as a result of the pandemic. And because of that, the gig economy and gig jobs became a lot more viable options for these people. And so that resulted in a huge spike in labor supply. And there was a need for more delivery. And a lot of businesses were expanding, such as Grubhub. And so the labor demand increased along with that, but the scales of those are unknown. But many people within the market that now had this large influx of workers had less work than they did before if they were already in the gig economy. We also see that there's a small wage elasticity of labor demand. So this means that as wages move up and down, the labor demand doesn't shift a ton. And so a lot of workers were taking lower wages as they were offered with the large influx of people. And so now, because of the large influx of people, there was a decrease there could have been a decrease in wage in some of the sectors. And then alongside that, we also saw the decreasing market power. As Reagan was talking about, a lot of these businesses don't hire their employees. And so a lot of the individual freelancers for either Uber or Grubhub are individually employed. They're kind of their own business. And with each additional person entering into the market, there's one more kind of business in there, which there's less control to set the price as an individual in the gig economy, which can result in a decrease in like price or price you're able to charge for your services. So those were some of the specific results that we've seen of COVID on the gig market.
So, as David also touched upon in his presentation, many industries experienced what was called automation forcing due to COVID. This is when firms or businesses experience an abnormal shock that requires adaptation through a rapid increase in technology. In her working paper, Betsy Stevenson explains that such rapid development and adaptation to new technology leads to workers and firms permanently changing their ways of working in the long run. Likewise, in a study of Canada's labor market, Gian and Ostrovsky argue that the gig economy prior to COVID was a growing industry thriving off of the use of technology such as smartphones and apps. They further argue that the surge of use of technology could lead to a long-term impact of an increase in market size for the gig economy. With this, it's thought that it could potentially see an increase in labor demand and labor supply for the gig economy when the market grows. While both could see an increase, it's understood that the increase in labor supply could be a much greater shock than the increase in labor demand in the long run. This could lead to an increase in employment. However, in terms of wages, we cannot definitively say how they will change in the long run due to the ambiguity of the pandemic as well as the market. Finally, the implementation of certain policies such as paid sick time off or a decrease in payroll taxes may lead to an increase in workers joining the gig economy labor force in the long run. University of Southern California professor Kenneth King Stonier predicts that the gig economy will undergo a substitution effect where workers will trade their normal 8-hour workday for a job in the gig economy under the new policies. According to the predictions, with the added benefit from these policies, the gig economy will become much more enticing to low-skilled or even low-paid individuals in the long run. Thank you all so much for watching our presentation, and the next 2 slides are our references.